So good afternoon, everyone. I am Britany Waddell. I am Assistant Planning Director with the City of Raleigh, North Carolina, and incoming President for ITGA. Thank you so much for joining us today. Just a few housekeeping things. One thing I'll note, we designed this webinar specifically like this in gallery mode so we can interact with each other. Please feel free, if you are able to and willing, to cut your camera on. Let us see your smiling faces. And we want this to be a dialogue as we go through the presentation. Feel free to raise your hand, use the raise hand feature to ask questions. We're happy to take questions throughout the presentation. We have a chat and Q&A feature. Encourage you to use both of those if you have questions for us, and we can stop periodically to answer questions also as they come in. This will be, as you may have noted when you entered, this session is being recorded. It'll be available for you on the ITGA website, hopefully by early next week. So look out for that and feel free to share information about it to others who may not have been able to attend today. So we'll go ahead and jump right in. Thank you once again for joining us, spend a little time with us this afternoon. This is a very important topic that I'm very passionate about and excited to have our two presenters here today to help us with it. Human trafficking is something that most of us in ITGA don't really talk about in our general webinars and conferences and things that we've done. In my work at the City of Raleigh, was able to attend the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill School of Government hosted a municipal administration course that I attended over the last year. And Margaret, one of our presenters, taught a class on human trafficking. And I was very struck by the parallels to the work that I do in planning and zoning, and just red flags, things that I wouldn't think to look for, wouldn't think to cue me as to something being wrong. And I feel like it's an important conversation that we all need to be kind of tuned in on. With colleges and universities, we have a very unique set of student populations and different dynamics in our communities that make us ripe for this type of crime in ways that I was not aware of. So it meant a lot to me to be able to work with Beth and Susan to host this webinar and expose you guys to some of this information. So I'm excited to have Margaret Henderson with the North Carolina UNC School of Government here to talk to us today, and also Dr. Nancy Hagan with the North Carolina Human Trafficking Commission. So I'm going to turn it over to them and stop talking and allow them to go through the presentation. But as I said, please feel free to dialogue and talk with us throughout the afternoon. Margaret?
Yeah, thanks so much, Britany, and thanks to all of you for making the time to be here today. I think it's fair to say that I am a practitioner working in an academic setting, and Nancy is a recovering academic working in a practitioner setting. She is the go-to person in North Carolina for trafficking as it relates to farm workers in particular. I've done work, and Nancy's done a lot of it with me in terms of understanding how local government staff might see the indicators of trafficking. And we are both highly appreciative of being given this opportunity to explore more about what college and university campuses might be seeing without realizing it. So we're going to go through this, and bear in mind that we may be upending some of the ways you think about this already. So naturally, this is the moment my slide doesn't want to present. There we go. All right, so we want to be talking about the myths and misinformation about sex and labor trafficking, because there is an infinite number of myths and misinformation out there. It's pretty horrifying, and we see new evidence of that every day. We want to talk about the vulnerabilities that traffickers might exploit that exist in, around, or near college campuses. And we want to just help y'all begin this conversation, if you haven't already, about learning more about trafficking and figuring out how you might better identify it, respond to it, or prevent it from happening in the first place. So we've got a broad agenda here. And I'll say right now that there are about 200 different rabbit holes, at least, that we could go down in our conversation. And Nancy and I will do our best to follow your lead in terms of whatever interests you the most. But to begin, and why don't you make some notations in chat here? Just think for a minute about what you've seen or heard about sex or labor trafficking. Doesn't matter what it is. And let's just get that in sort of a baseline read of what's been in your orbit about it. And while you're doing that, I'll just go ahead and talk about a couple of these examples. You know, a lot of us track the Epstein arrest and the exposure that came in terms of sex trafficking for the rich and famous. A lot of folks have seen the Taken trilogy and believe the Hollywood message about trafficking involving kidnapping and a lot of guns and explosions and scary looking men who tend to be of darker skin than the heroine. And probably a lot of us have seen something come across our Facebook feeds or elsewhere on social media about, you know, beware the potential kidnapping in the Walmart parking lot or something like that. Demi Moore is up there because in her autobiography that she published last year, she actually made reference to the fact that her mother exchanged her as a teenager, gave her to a man for a number of hours in exchange for drugs. That was human trafficking. She didn't call it that. Most of us wouldn't think of it in those terms, but that is what it was. And that's the single most important lesson we need to convey today, which is you're seeing it, but we're not calling it that. When I was at the Rape Crisis Center here in Orange County in the 90s, we saw those cases, but trafficking wasn't in our vocabulary, not socially, not legally. It's there now, and we need to learn how to talk about it. So what's popping up in the chat in terms of what's on people's radar about sex or labor trafficking?
Kidnapping in white vans. We got Pizzagate.
Yeah.
That it happens all around us and we don't even know. And that is a way to pay for college tuition.
Yeah. Selling sex is a way to pay for college tuition. And so we might get in at some point to distinguishing the nuances between sex work and sex trafficking. It's easy to conflate the two. They're not exactly the same. The ubiquitous white van, it shows up in so many different scenarios. And granted, there are a lot of white vans out there in the world, but that tends to go along with the scary kidnapper theory, which is actually not the thing you need to worry about the most. And y'all made reference to the Pizzagate thing. QAnon, unfortunately, is disseminating a lot of highly inaccurate information about sex trafficking in particular. So I just want to encourage all of you to check your sources and hopefully check your local service providers to find out what's really going on in your communities. Nancy, why don't you tell them what human trafficking really is?
Will do. And first off, I want to thank everybody, reiterate Margaret's comments. We're really happy to be here today. I have been on faculty or staff at lots of universities and colleges. You know, as you accumulate degrees, you spend time in those institutions. And but I think, and it's always been a challenge for me to broach and have one foot in action and one foot in thought. So it's that praxis balance, right? And I kind of go back and forth, never really figured out how to do both at one time. And currently I am with the North Carolina Human Trafficking Commission, which is the legislatively mandated leader in the anti-human trafficking movement in North Carolina. What I would love if people have the chance, since we're a small group, is to put in your affiliation. Are most of us on this call from academia, or are we town as well? Because that will help us focus on your interests as we go through this. And Margaret raises the really good point that a lot of us have notions about human trafficking. We hear that word in the press, certainly on social media, and we may or may not know what it is. I think I first encountered it when I was on the faculty, and I only worked with grad students at NCSU, North Carolina State, and a friend of a student of mine, I now believe, was being trafficked as a foreign national. At the time, I considered it a situation of domestic violence, and we often human trafficking is not discrete. It can be very hard to discern and to see what really is going on. To that end, we want to talk about human trafficking in its full spectrum, which is sex and labor trafficking. Lots and lots of folks, especially in the media, conflate sex trafficking and human trafficking. Well, sex trafficking is a subset. So it's one kind of human trafficking. And that's really important to know on college campuses and in the surrounding towns, because students who have economic instability in particular may be vulnerable to being exploited through their labor as well. So this is the federal law. First federal law was passed in 2000. It's called the TVPA, and it has been renewed a few times. And it defines human trafficking on the federal level. Now, states have their own laws. We're in North Carolina. North Carolina is pretty concordant with this. So we'll start with the beginning. Minors, i.e. anyone under the age of 18 who's involved in any kind of commercial sex act or activity, is automatically, unequivocally considered a victim of human trafficking. Why? Because minors cannot consent to engage in commercial sex. So again, as Margaret said, Demi Moore would have been a victim of sex trafficking, even if, for instance, and I haven't read her book, but her mom accepted drugs or something of value in exchange for sex acts on behalf of Demi as a minor. It doesn't have to be money. So there's not always a cash or a financial transaction. The definition of human trafficking is anything in exchange for something of value. Sometimes with students, we see that thing of value is a place on a couch, a roof over their head, a hot meal, some place to crash, books, tuition, whatever it is. But any minor across this country cannot engage in commercial sex through their own consent. Something's missing from that definition. With labor, they can. So minors who are engaged in labor through this second block that we have here, force, fraud, or coercion, has to be shown. So I'm sorry, I'm not being really straightforward here. So let me just skip ahead. So adults who are induced into commercial sex activity through force, fraud, or coercion are considered victims. So if they do it of their own consent, free will, that's up for debate. There's a lot of talk now about willing and consensual sex work versus or in addition to sex trafficking. But let's just say adults can consent to engage in commercial sex. If that consent is induced through force, fraud, or coercion, that's when it becomes human trafficking for adults. But with labor trafficking, both minors and adults have to be induced to perform the labor or the services. Could be house cleaning, could be working in a factory, could be construction, could be farm work, could be door-to-door sales. Force, fraud, or coercion must be shown. So with sex trafficking and minors, no force, fraud, coercion. With labor, yes. And that gets really tricky because in our Western society, we value work. And lots of teenagers work. Child labor laws vary state to state. Of course, there are federal laws as well, but we don't find it unsettling or uncommon to see a 15 or 16-year-old in the grocery store or on various given work sites. So that's a big distinction between, I said human trafficking's of a piece, but there are distinctions between sex and labor trafficking with minors. And then there's a third kind of human trafficking that we almost never talk about in the United States, but we do worldwide, and it's organ trafficking. So the harvesting and selling of someone's organs. We don't think that happens really in the United States. I've never seen a documented case, but we wanted to bring it to your attention because it is part of the federal law.
Then there's another field emerging related to women being forced to be pregnant, have children, and being kept in limited circumstances. Now, you're not going to see them because they're not going to be allowed to pursue their educational opportunities, but that's happening in some other countries, and there's been a case here in the United States as well.
So what traffickers do is they use specific environmental conditions to recruit, market, and exploit people. So the TVPA, this federal law that I talked about, actually names several elements of human trafficking, including recruitment, harboring, transporting, trafficking, and exploitation. So the TVPA, this federal law that I talked about, actually names several elements of human trafficking, including recruitment, harboring, transporting, trafficking, and exploitation. provision, and obtaining. But we're going to focus on the recruitment, the marketing, and the actual end result, which is the exploitation. The media, and I think popular thought, addresses the transporting piece. And I always say that I wish we had a different name for this crime, because trafficking sounds like motion. It sounds like you're moving somebody from one place to another. Lots of people, including politicians, confuse smuggling and trafficking. They're different crimes. One is crossing a national border without authorization, and the other one is the exploitation of a human being's human rights, and that's the trafficking. So you don't have to move anybody in order to traffic them. It can happen in someone's home, dorm room, kitchen, common area. But that is the phrase that we use. It's the legal definition, and I just want to bring that up. But
and Nancy, also, I would think when you think about it, I guess in these categories, it's not always someone who's being held captive. Because I always envision it as like someone's being held hostage or held against their will and forced to do things, as opposed to being free to come and go, but still being held in some kind of obligation.
Thank you for bringing that up, Britany. That's very true. And I think especially Hollywood or the media focus on the force piece, the force, fraud, or coercion. Fraud and coercion are very subtle and can be hard to depict. And they also can be easily woven into the fabric of our society, whereas the white van is compelling. The thought that someone's being snatched at the mall or the playground strikes fear into the heart of people who care about others. And so the fraud and the coercion are really subtle, and they're not as compelling an image. But thank you for bringing that up. And as we'll go through this, we'll see that coercion is really the predominant means of control of people. And when Margaret and I talk, or when we do trainings, folks who are not part of this type of group are often really astounded to hear that colleges and universities might be one of the environmental sectors in which human trafficking can occur. But it does, and we thank you again for inviting us today to talk about that. Margaret, did you want to speak to any of these others?
No, I just encourage you to think about your own communities when you look at this list, because we're going to make the point in a minute that what the features that are in your community, your surrounding areas, it's going to affect how the trafficking happens there. But we can pause and see if anyone has any questions about how these features are involved in trafficking, please ask. We'll be happy to do that. If not, I'll move on to the next slide. You ready, Nancy?
I am. Okay. So people want to know and think about what human trafficking actually is, and they also want to know numbers. What are the analytics? What's the data? What's the empirical evidence? Well, that's kind of hard to come by. And in large part, because this is a newly identified crime. Remember, the first federal law was only passed in 2000. And it's very hard to prosecute. We don't have great collective means of gathering data. What we do have is a national human trafficking hotline that's supported by the federal government and run by a nonprofit called the Polaris Project. And I encourage anybody who's interested in this topic to Google polarisproject.org. We'll be talking a lot about them this afternoon. They staff the hotline with highly trained folks, and they also do data analysis, collect data, and do data analysis. However, and this is the big caveat, the data that they report is only the data that they collect. So basically, they're reporting the number of calls that they get to their hotline. That is not indicative of the incidence or prevalence of human trafficking across the country. It's only the folks that call the hotline. So for instance, we have service agencies here in North Carolina. They may be dealing with a number of victims and survivors on the ground, but they're not reporting to Polaris because they're handling it on their own. So we think that human trafficking, both labor and sex, is highly, significantly underreported. Nonetheless, in 2019, you can see the numbers that there were over 20,000 cases I called into the hotline, and those are verified cases. So that's not just the totality of the calls that came in. The hotline respondents will go through a very brief assessment, and those are the calls that are vetted to have actually some indicators of human trafficking. From those data, Polaris annually, well, until the pandemic, until 2020, creates a heat map of the incidence of trafficking across the country. And you can see that the coasts and the Chicago area, the upper Midwest, have significant clusters or numbers of trafficking cases reported to the hotline. Now, that, if you're academics, you know, correlation doesn't mean causality. We don't know why those calls are going in. It may be just that Polaris has done a better job getting the word out in those areas, or it may be actually that there is a higher rate of trafficking. But you can see where you're located, and you can also see that trafficking has been reported in every state of the country, and actually now in every county in the United States.
I was just about to say, it looks like all major cities.
Lots of major cities, but it's really hidden in rural areas as well, where folks may be particularly vulnerable and not have access to resources and support, but probably highly underrated and reported in rural areas. But yeah, so basically the message here is nobody can say it's not happening here, because it's happening everywhere. It's documented to be happening everywhere. Margaret, is this you or me? I think it's you.
Okay, I'll do it. So it, as Nancy just said, it happens everywhere, but the forms it takes depends on the local characteristics. So on the heat map, you know, where it was so hot down in Florida, that may be because of all the farm work that's down there and all the tourism that's down there. When it's up in Idaho, Utah, Wyoming, it may be connected with the oil and gas industry or casinos or something like that. So you really have to take into consideration the economic base that surrounds you and the opportunity that surrounds you. Now, the really hard part, and I do mean this sincerely, is that the traffickers, the victims, and the customers can look like any of us. Really and truly, there is not a stereotype. So I might be the high-end woman who has a professional life and belongs to the junior league, not to dump on them, and I live in a big house somewhere, and I'm keeping somebody in domestic servitude to take care of my kids and my elderly mother-in-law. And I'm not very nice to that person, pure and simple. So the more you read about this, the more surprises you're going to get hit with in terms of who shows up for it. So I encourage you to just be patient as you integrate that information, because it's not always easy. Nancy, do you want to say a little more about that?
Sure. So we mentioned previously that human trafficking is a crime that depends on a mechanism of control for a particular outcome. And the outcome is the sexual or labor exploitation of another human being. We often talk about the AMP model. So the act, the means, and the purpose. The acts are what I mentioned previously, like recruiting, harboring, transporting. But we're going to, and the purpose I just mentioned, the means are what we're going to focus on today, the force, fraud, and coercion. That's the piece that can be really hard to discern, and it is the element that has to take place in order for the crime of human trafficking to have been committed. So there has to be force, fraud, or coercion, except remember, if it's a minor engaged in commercial sex. So the force is what the media loves. Social media, mainstream media, broadcast media, Hollywood, the physical restraint or confinement. But like you said, Britany, it does occur, but we do not believe that is the most common form of or means of manipulation and control. Force may occur at the outset of a trafficking situation data are now showing that it's actually more likely to occur in order to maintain control. So the person is already being exploited, say they're trying to leave the situation, or they're complaining, or they're not producing a quota that's being demanded of them. And that may be where force is more likely to come into play. And that force could look like sexual assault. It could look a lot like domestic violence. It could look like locks on the exterior of doors rather than interior of doors. It can look like physical restraint or beatings. So, but oftentimes that occurs during the course of the exploitation, not at the outset. So the fraud can occur both within scenarios of sex and labor trafficking, common in both, exceedingly common with labor trafficking. So it's sort of like a bait and switch, where a job is promised that's just too good to be true, or the working conditions change. If you think about the worst job that you've ever had, it probably wasn't trafficking. It may have just been an awful job where the job description didn't match what you ended up doing. You know, that line that's always there, and other job duties as required. But the fraud is when there's an upheaval, a disjuncture between the employment that was promised and then what actually happens. We see this an awful lot. The most common form of labor trafficking in the United States is farm work. And as Margaret said, I do have a lot of experience with that. And we see this all the time in farm work. We see where people aren't paid the wages that they were promised. We will spend some time talking about some of the visa categories that students can enter the United States on, F1s and J1s in particular, and fraud can play a role in the human trafficking of students on those visas. But coercion really is the means that's most typically used to control other people. And if anyone's ever, probably all of us, been in a relationship with a 13-year-old or maybe a 2-year-old where they're using their skill set to manipulate you to either stay out an extra hour at night if they're the 13-year-old or the 2-year-old in the candy line at the store, we've all been coerced, and probably some of us have succumbed. I have 4 kids. I certainly have. I know it's happening. Sometimes if they're a master manipulator, I don't know that it's happening. Well, traffickers tend to be master manipulators, and they encroach, they up the ante of coercion. So oftentimes traffickers are people who have initiated or are already in a relationship with the victim, and they use the ground of that relationship to manipulate the victim into doing something that violates their own human rights. And again, as Margaret said, it could be a mother and a daughter. It's often a romantic relationship or a pseudo-romantic relationship, or it could be a boss and an employee, but there's some sort of relationship. It's not the stranger danger that we would think of when we think of force. And again, we're all capable of being manipulated because we all have needs, desires, wants, strength sets, and traffickers are very astute at checking out vulnerabilities and then going for the jugular. Some of the forms that can take are included here.
And we want to really encourage y'all to build your skills in terms of recognizing the nuances of these elements as people talk to them, because students are not going to come up to you and say, I've been trafficked and I need help. You're going to have to hear the indicators that, oh, she thought this was a relationship. He talked her into sending him photos. Now he's saying if she doesn't show up at the party to satisfy his buddies, that he's going to spread the photos all over campus. You know, those kinds of incremental stages of manipulation and abuse. What we need you to remember about traffickers, I mean, Nancy just said that they're magnificent manipulators. They are predators, pure and simple. And they can identify a vulnerability from a mile away and figure out how to exploit it. And I know all of you in your towns and on your campuses have encountered students or faculty or A's or staff who are experiencing some form of vulnerability. So I'm not going to go through all of these with you. You can imagine how they might be manipulated. But what I want you to do is just focus in on the fact there is a vulnerability of some sort, and the predators will zoom in on those vulnerabilities. If you're doing anything on your campus to address these challenges, you've got Gay, Lesbian, Bi Center that's very welcoming and creates a community for those students, for example, then you are working actually to prevent trafficking, because you are compensating for those vulnerabilities and trying to replace them with a strength. One thing I will say about immigration status, and Nancy will talk to you more about that, and this is what I've learned from Nancy, any status other than full citizenship is a vulnerability. Whether you're here on a visa or you're here as an undocumented person, the fact that you're not a full citizen in whatever country you're in can be a cause for manipulation. Anything else you want to say about this nasty little spider web, Nancy?
Well, I know you're going to talk a little bit about food insecurity. You may wonder how natural disasters factor into human trafficking. Well, these vulnerabilities that are listed here are only some of the human vulnerabilities, right? But they speak to larger conditions that Polaris has identified as underlying factors and vulnerabilities towards victimization. And one would be the lack of social networks, or a loss of social networks, loss of housing, loss of a job, basically the absence of the basic structures that keep us upright and connected to our communities. So we know that, and I remember that many colleges and universities on the East Coast of North Carolina have had to be evacuated due to hurricanes. What happens if you don't have a home that you can readily go to? Our natural disaster plan in North Carolina is, has been during COVID, to quote, and this is on the plan, primary or ideally find family or friends with whom you can stay if you need to evacuate. Sounds good if you have family and friends who are supportive and have the extra room, but what if you don't? What if you're an international student? What if you're from Alaska? What if you're vulnerable in that way? We know that people who identify as LGBTQ+ are highly vulnerable to trafficking, largely because there is oftentimes conflict with a family of origin and or their immediate society, and that may invoke their either moving from home, leaving home, or being kicked out of home and having instability in that way. And then we also know, some of you have probably heard a lot about the ACEs scores, where there a history of physical or sexual or emotional trauma in childhood and youth can be highly correlated with vulnerabilities in adulthood. So if a child or youth has been taught that they're, for instance, a commodity, their body's a thing that exists for the pleasure and use of another human being, and you've been groomed throughout your childhood, if you've experienced or seen someone else experience abuse, you may be highly vulnerable as a college student to get involved in relationships which are not stable, healthy, or supportive of you as an individual. And so all of these things, I mean, we could give a seminar on each one of these vulnerabilities, but I just wanted to bring some of those to your attention.
And the traffickers don't care if these are vulnerabilities that have been with you all of your life, or if they just turned up in the last month. It's a vulnerability, it can be exploited. We're going to give you a couple examples about what's in the news in terms of college campuses, and I imagine y'all are aware of this Sarah Lawrence college situation that just boggles the mind. So many red flags in this situation, starting with a father was allowed to move into his daughter's dorm for an extended period of time. You know, there are red flags flying with that already. But I think the important point is this guy must be an incredible manipulator. I mean, he stayed there. He manipulated these young women, and he manipulated folks apparently on the college campus so that he was allowed to fly under the radar and not be confronted about his inappropriate presence or behaviors. There are manipulators out there who could probably target any one of us here and play a game with us, a pretty unattractive game. So none of us are entitled to think so highly of our resilience and protective factors to think that we might never be victimized. It can really come in a side door and surprise any of us. Now, a colleague of mine here in the building, Dr. Maureen Berner, surveyed 5,000 students here at UNC. And this is what she found out. Food insecurity, it's a thing. It's common. 25% of our undergraduate students that year were food insecure, and it increased the closer they got to graduation. I suspect many of your campuses would find similar statistics there. So we tend to assume, particularly on this is a flagship campus of North Carolina, we might assume that our students have everything they need, and that may not be the case. And somebody else might see that vulnerability and target it.
Margaret, can I ask a question?
Yeah.
On that one, the last note about it increasing towards their progression to a degree, is that because they generally move off campus and maybe like living off campus and not maybe on meal plans like they might be in a freshman or sophomore years?
I can't speak to that. I don't think her research addressed why. It was just the time connection to graduation that they captured in that research.
Margaret, can I ask a question as well? I love that one, Britany. The slide before this on the gentleman that moved in with his daughter. So I'm looking at situations where, I was in Tempe, Arizona, and we had 1 million off-campus apartments. And there were times when we would have other people that lived in these off-campus apartments. They're open to the community as a whole. However, we knew primarily they were dorms, but they were off campus. So primarily there were all ASU students that attended or lived in those apartments. But then there would be a random, grandma, or maybe even a gentleman like this that looked like a father figure that might live there. What advice would you give to these communities to ensure that they're not, being or coercing students in a way that they would be in a situation of sex trafficking or abuse?
Well, what we do is we just encourage you to pay attention to the red flags, and we recognize that the red flags might be visible to very different people. Like maybe it's the guys who pick up the trash and recycling who notice that there are way too many people living in that apartment, and the age gender relationship equation just doesn't make a whole lot of sense. Or maybe they see people there looking stressed for some reason. So you raise the red flags, you see them. If you're in the appropriate role, you may have the opportunity to ask a few more questions about the people, about what's going on here. Or maybe it's just that you report to law enforcement, to Polaris or someone else. But the challenge, Ron, is there's not an equation. If these elements are all visible elements are all evident, that for sure it's trafficking. It could be something else. So you just have to ask a lot more questions. Nancy, what would you advise?
Something similar. And my understanding of this situation, so Sarah Lawrence is a fairly elite college, and the students that were exploited did not look like highly vulnerable students. They were, for the most part, wealthy. They were male and female. But we do know that developmentally, I'm a human developmentalist by heart and academic study, college students are changing. They're developmentally very vulnerable to questions of identity, intimacy, connection. And this father came in and took advantage of that. Again, my understanding is that, Ron, it's much like the situation you talk about, where the housing was actually provided by Sarah Lawrence, but it was not a dorm room in a row, but an apartment on campus. But I think the students prepared their own meals, so they weren't going to a cafeteria, they weren't participating in a meal plan outside that apartment. So it was really, really easy for him to gain the trust of those students. Oh, I'm so-and-so's dad. I just, I love her, and it's so great of you to be here. And then he encroached as a father figure and a mentor. We encourage our students to have mentors. This guy was very savvy, and he took advantage of that. It's tough when you're talking about off-campus housing. Just knowing about this case, I've stayed with my daughters on their college campuses, and I think, like for a night in an off-campus place, and I think, oh, I wonder if anyone's gonna wonder what I'm doing here. Am I suspect? But parents do visit, and relatives do visit, and older friends do visit, or siblings, and we're moving a little bit away from red flags and more about prevention as the building of relationships with vulnerable folks, so that there is trust and people will be able to share their narrative, their history, their story, and that a trusted figure can then begin to think about what might actually be going on. Because it doesn't always look like what it is. And most people, as Margaret said, don't identify as victims. A lot of people don't know what it is, and who wants to be a victim? So college kids will say, I've got this under control. I can handle this. I know what I'm doing. They really don't want adults telling them that they're doing something wrong. So the idea is to build that trusting relationship where they'll come to you and convey what's happening, and then you can begin to work with them. Yeah, this comment from Britany, yes.
Yeah.
Yep. Student services, which encompasses everything that we do in the classroom and outside. We also know that youth in particular, but everybody is increasingly vulnerable to being recruited and engaged in exploitative situations through social media, the internet, all our apps, and especially dating sites. So, the swipe right, they're on all the time. This is what people do. I suspect that 2 hours, 24 minutes daily on social media in 2020, yeah, that might have been before the pandemic.
Yeah.
February.
I can't believe that number. I think I beat that, and I'm as uncool as they come.
So we all know this. It's a truism. You can be anybody on social media. The thought is that people who identify as male are more likely to be gaming, more likely women game as well, and that could be an avenue of recruitment for boys and male identifying youth and men through gaming, because you have an avatar. You can be a bot. You can be whoever you want to be. Margaret, were you going to say any more about this one?
No, again, it's an indirect thing, but just I think what it does primarily is highlight the fact that traffickers are predators. Predators use opportunities. This is an incredible opportunity for them to manipulate. So I imagine most of you have heard about sugar babies. Nancy's daughter was applying for grants and loans. And how long did it take before pop-up ads were showing up on her screen?
About 15 seconds.
Yeah. And of course, I will just speak that I've had at least one conversation with an undergrad who speaks of sugar babies as a demonstration of sexual autonomy and ownership of their own body. And yes, I understand why they're saying that. And it can also be the initial point of vulnerability that then gets exploited down the road if the wrong guy signs up to be your sugar daddy. But we just bring that up because unfortunately, this is a fairly common practice on campuses. And it's a good thing to inquire about when you're talking with students. It is increasingly becoming the norm.
Pretty much anytime I talk with college students after a presentation like this one, someone hangs out afterwards and comes up and says, I have a friend who's on seeking arrangements, you know, they couldn't pay their tuition or they want to make some extra money, and they say they've got it all in hand, but I'm worried about them. And there's a great book, I don't know if any of you have read it, it's called Postgrad. It was written by a Princeton grad, a woman, I think maybe 2015 or 2016, and it's narratives of 5 of her cohort, all women who their first year after graduation, and one of the women is a foreign national, and she gets involved in seeking arrangements as an undergrad at Princeton. Again, so we can't say, oh, this doesn't happen at elite schools, or people take care of their own. Not so. She gets involved in seeking arrangements because her family didn't, I believe, I read it a long time ago, her family didn't like her major, and so they cut off her financial aid. And she wanted to stay and needed to support herself to show that she had the funds to stay in the United States and complete her degree. So she turned to seeking arrangements with the confidence that Margaret was speaking to. Is like, I got this. I'm a smart woman. I'm at Princeton. I'm sophisticated. I've lived in different countries in the world. I can handle this. And then it starts to get out of control. So again, the incremental nature of trafficking, it doesn't always present as trafficking, but it can, not always, grow into it.
One thing to explore, and this applies to labor trafficking as well, you know, a difference is if the person tries to leave the situation, something bad will happen to them. So you can just inquire, well, what would happen if you stopped being a sugar baby? And if it's just, oh, I won't have as much money to spend, okay. But if, oh, my sugar daddy might get mad, or he said that he's going to do X, Y, and Z if I stop dating him, then your red flag should really be flying. But just inquire around it. So we're going to talk about study abroad vulnerabilities for just a few moments. There's this one article, we've got it referenced there. And we're not talking about this in terms of our students going to other countries and then being kidnapped and sold. We're going to flip it on you here. However, this article does say that 74% of the countries listed in studyabroad.com do not meet the requirements of the Trafficking Victims Protection Act. So they are going to countries that are a bit more vulnerable to having trafficking happening in the fabric of their society one way or another. Just FYI, it would be good to let students know about that. Now, in this situation, what I want you to think about is if students are unaware of the cultural norms or things to be concerned about wherever they're going, they may inadvertently put themselves at risk or participate in trafficking. So, for example, if you've got a student in Amsterdam who thinks, oh, great, sex workers everywhere, I'll go down the street and pick out the one in the window I want to use. That student may be unaware that that sex worker is actually not there of his or her own accord and cannot leave. They might be participating as a buyer of a trafficked person. So it's important that students be educated about these risks that may be in whatever countries they go to.
And a lot of that is cultural read. So our ability to be culturally humble when we travel overseas, we may get an orientation that's 2 days or a few days, but like that picture that I took in Prague, okay, I've lived in a lot of countries and I've traveled all over the world. I was not expecting clowns. First of all, I'm scared of clowns to be used as a means of advertising massage businesses. And then €9 for a massage, that's pretty darn cheap. You think about if you go to a legitimate massage here in the United States, what it'll cost you like 65 to 80 bucks for a 60-minute massage. So €9 is exceedingly cheap. And if you are 19 or 20 years old, it's your first time overseas, you see this clown, you see the I love Thai massage, you see that the Thai massage is open 24/7, and you think it's a lark. Hey, this is cool, this is fun. And you may inadvertently become a person who is obtaining services that are actually human trafficking. So you may be purchasing the labor or sex of someone who's being trafficked without any self-awareness, but just an inability to read the culture.
Good example, Nancy. This one relates to the fact that service industries that support students overseas may employ trafficked people, and that they used hostels as a primary example, but apparently it also happens in food service and even some medical services as well. So this is just an example of the trafficking can be embedded in ways that you can't see, just like you may not see the trafficked people who do the office cleaning at night in your community, wherever you are. They are simply, they present normally, or you may not see them at all during work hours, but they may be there. With this situation, they just make the point that there's not any kind of centralized vetting system for fraudulent recruitment. And this is really important because of how people in other countries are recruited to come here, for example. Here's a case in Florida. They recruited students from Kazakhstan, and they came to Florida expecting to be put, go to classes and work in a yoga studio. So they were smart enough to avoid modeling, housekeeping, cleaning services as sort of red flag trafficking industries. Talked about working in a yoga studio, and these students were not allowed to go to school, and they were working very long hours. So that's a court case that's going on now. But that's people here in the States doing the fraudulent recruitment to students in other places. And that brings us back around to people who are not full citizens here. Nancy, please talk about this particular vulnerability.
Sure. So the group that Margaret was just mentioning from Kazakhstan were on J1 visas. And there are two kinds of visas that lots of you probably know about, which students often secure in order to come to the United States. So the first is an F1, and that's the student visa that foreign nationals and international students need to get in order to study in the United States from elementary school through post-grad. So it's called a single intent visa. That means you're here to study. That is your primary thing that you can do, not work. You can't get federal grants or funding, so you can't participate in what traditional work study, which is supported by the federal government on campus. You can have a campus job on campus as long as it pertains to your area of study. You sign on to study here and return to your home country after completion of whatever program you're engaged in. And a really big requirement for this visa is that a person has to show that they have liquid assets sufficient to support their first year of study in the United States. And so to me, that means a couple things. One, we're getting the elite international students because many countries do not have the currency or incomes that are equivalent to those in the United States. So even if you were doing well or so-called middle class in your home country, you may not have the funding to pay a private university here in the United States or the out-of-state tuition and fees that would be required of you at a state school. So getting that money and showing that it's available to the person, there's lots of federal requirements. The federal government tries to set up barriers for fraud there, but I wanted to point out that that is a potential place of fraud. So that's the F1 visa. It's a student visa. The J1 visa is available. It's called a cultural exchange. It's a non-immigrant visa. There are 7 types of non-immigrant visas. It's a temporary non-immigrant visa. This is the one where we see professors, researchers, students on vacation, on exchange. There has to be theoretically some sort of cultural value to the experience that they're having in the United States. Sometimes that cultural value is working in Disneyland or at a beach resort, cleaning houses. It's fairly loose, and so situation that Margaret was just referring to was actually a manipulation of the J1 visa requirements. And those students were exploited. Again, there's supposed to be strict parameters around the hours that one can work and where a person can work. They are often violated. What I don't have on here are DACA students, so deferred action students. Those are students who were, many of you probably know, brought to the United States before the age of 15 and have, it's almost like a temporary protected status in the United States. They don't have what is truly called legal status. So many DACA kids, I'll call them kids, if they want to pursue post-secondary education, even though they may have been brought to the United States as a 4-day-old and grown up here, if they don't have legal status in the United States and are covered under DACA, they're paying out-of-state or foreign national fees in most states. Now, some states have and some universities have different requirements. They're not eligible for federal funding. Their parents may not know how to fill out a FAFSA. Their parents may not have social security numbers, and the kids are really overwhelmed. They don't want to go to a college financial aid office and admit that their parents don't have legal status in the United States and don't know how to fill out that form. I see this all the time because that's a population that I work very closely with. And so we have this whole cohort of very earnest, bright, capable people who are facing barriers to access higher education and may then be highly vulnerable to other forms of exploitation, including fraud and coercion. So
Nancy, I saw Ron nodding his head there.
well, you're in Arizona, right? So you've probably experienced this.
We did. I mean, we had a lot of, first of all, we had about 10,000 international students.
Yeah.
Secondly, we had a lot of undocumented, but also documented students. And so I was really listening to, you know, what you were saying about, you know, their vulnerability. There were a lot of times they, you know, they wouldn't share with us who their parents' names and so forth, because, you know, the more that they were outward with their status, there was a possibility for one of us as administrators to make a mistake and out their parents, which would then out them. So yeah, it's a really, really tricky situation. I mean, I'm in Kentucky now at Eastern Kentucky University, and we're, you know, it's the same thing.
Mm, it's everywhere.
You know, there are a lot of undocumented people here as well, because, you know, it's a growing, you know, harvesting place. And, you know, so we're still dealing with it here as well. So that DACA or undocumented status does make you very vulnerable, and you don't want to talk about it. You don't want to out your parents. And if someone holds that over your head, it really begins to be a way of coercion to get you to do something you never thought you would do.
Absolutely, because you're protecting your family. Absolutely.
Yeah.
Well, I'm going to say something too. The situation that I see here is about economics. It's just for many of those individuals, it's just they don't have the means to achieve their goals. So I'm here listening to all of this and then realize, okay, we track that down. We try to stop doing these things, but then how do they achieve their goals? What are we putting in place to support those students? They can come to us, but we can't be able to give them the paperwork. They cannot become documented because we don't have that power. But then at the same time, they want to continue their desires to finish the school. So what is it that we can do then? And of course, you see in international, it's just people want to find a better life, and they find any ways to do that. And so how do we deal with the essence of that issue, the real issue? So I'm here, and I was waiting just to see what the other aspects that we need to look into as a university, how we can help on that end, on the front end.
it's definitely one problem that's connected to another problem that's connected to another problem that's connected to another problem. And I wish there was a clean fix to any element of it, and there's not. It's all interconnected. So bringing up these questions about the ripple effect of changes is certainly relevant, Gloria, and thanks for making that comment. Here's another example of international students. These folks were from Brazil, and they came to a community college, for God's sake, which I don't know, many of us would think would be the most innocent setting that there could possibly be. And yet they ended up working virtually nonstop in a pet food factory. And that case has not been settled yet. But all this to say is what these situations appear or present with very different characteristics. So you can't look for just one thing. So Nancy, COVID.
Of course, we have to talk about COVID because this has been really 2 academic years like no others, right? And so I tried to parse out some of the impacts that we could imagine or see regarding both domestic born students and international students. They're similar but different. So the campus closures, you know, from a Friday to a Monday, campus is closed. I got the call. Well, my daughter was actually, my youngest was on spring break in Canada when she got the word that her college in Connecticut was closing, and she couldn't get, also the Canadian border had shut down, so she couldn't get back. She couldn't get her stuff out of her on-campus housing. We had to try to find a friend of a friend of a friend who could move all of her belongings to some third setting. It happened quickly. So that we remember early on, we talked about disruption and natural disasters. I would call COVID a natural disaster. We all lost our bearings. I suspect there's not a human being in the world that didn't experience some degree of significant upheaval due to COVID. And if you say you're a boy who identifies as transgender and your safe place is to live on campus, and all of a sudden your campus closes and you're supposed to go back home, but your parents have said you cannot come back home unless you identify as the girl that you were born biologically identified at birth. So what do? And then you have maybe somebody who offers you a place to stay. So the loss of housing, the loss of the meal plan, loss of internet access, we know all of this because we've lived through it. And maybe some of us were sturdier and had connections that sustained us through that immediate emergency. But again, to a greater or lesser degree, we all experienced upheaval, and traffickers take advantage of the most vulnerable among us. So other people lost their work study income or their on-campus job, which they needed. I know I went through a lot of schooling. By junior, senior year in college, even though I wasn't supposed to, I was working over 40 hours a week because I had to. Through grad school, same. Without that income, I don't know where I would have been. Maybe on the streets. So some people with that loss of income became exceedingly vulnerable. We all really upped our time online. And then the mental health factors and the social isolation, especially again, if we think about the developmental status of 18 to 24-year-olds, they're all about building those intimate relationships and social relationships, and their identity. Take away those social networks abruptly, especially, and the mental health factors can be really significant. And again, easily manipulated by someone who comes in and says, I'm your friend, or I'm your lover, or I'm your partner, or I have your best interest at heart. I know you, I'll take care of you. It's a human need to want to have ourselves tended. So the international students, lots of people were unable to return home. Remember, the airlines shut down. Many countries are still shut down. So my youngest got a job in admissions out of college. She's working there now. I went up to visit her, and all these kids were on campus. It's a small college. I said, what are they all doing here? She said, Mom, they're international students. They can't go home. So the school had to open up dorms this summer for them to stay. I said, how are they eating? How are they working? And she said they've had to try to find the school is working with them, and they're a small school so that they are able to do that. But COVID's not over, so these effects are still ongoing. The F1 and the J1 visa requirements are really strict about whether a person can work off campus during the semester in particular, and how many hours they can work on campus and at what kinds of jobs. So again, during COVID, if you've lost your campus job, you could be highly vulnerable. Possible loss of housing if they move to remote learning, and then again the isolation and mental health factors compounded by possible cultural dissonance.
The overlay between who was most vulnerable to COVID and who is most vulnerable to trafficking was actually pretty close to total, minus the elderly population in communal living sites. So let's hope we can learn from identifying those vulnerabilities that enabled the transmission of COVID and apply those preventive techniques there to this different arena. Now I'm seeing we're going through our time, so we're going to pick up speed a little bit here and just get back to the basics of human trafficking and point you at some resources you can use. Polaris used all the calls that went into the National Human Trafficking Hotline and identified 25 different business models of human trafficking. Bear in mind, always with trafficking, somebody is making money. It's not just one person being mean to another person for fun. They're being mean to another person to make money somehow, some way. Some of these models of trafficking are not what you might think. We've already mentioned things like the nighttime cleaning crews that come into offices. And we've talked about sex workers, and we've talked a little about folks who work in restaurants or what have you, or massage parlors. There are also folks who beg on the street corners and all at the off ramps. There are folks who work in carnivals or work in the logging industry, or in North Carolina, the Christmas tree industry, for example. We encourage you to look at these 25 different business models to give you a sense of what's around in your own community, and therefore point you at the types of trafficking that might be happening. We're going to be sharing a bulletin in which Nancy and I took these 25 different business models, got focus groups of local government staff together, and just basically said, if this was going on in your community, who would see it? And what we found out that trash collecting, solid waste management, recycling guys, they go everywhere. Inspectors end up in all kinds of homes, businesses, and construction sites. I really don't care what you're inspecting, but if you're inspecting anything, you have the potential to see indicators of trafficking. So that bulletin highlights some local government positions that you might underestimate in terms of their capacity to see the indicators of trafficking. So again, 2 places for you to look for this resource. One is on the Polaris site, and the other is on our the School of Government bulletin on this that will be shared with you via Town and Gown. Nancy, we've talked about this a little bit, but please distinguish what's the difference between a bad job and human trafficking?
Okay, I'm going to talk over my barking English setter, so I apologize. He never barks. English setters point, they don't bark, figures. So we've kind of touched on supply chains. And so oftentimes the supply chains for both goods and services that we engage in are not transparent to us. If I order something on Amazon, if I order my textbooks on Amazon, I have no idea where or how they were produced, nor do I really care. What I care about is getting the lowest price for my book. And so I want to bring that up as part, we often think about that in terms of labor trafficking, but Margaret hit the nail on the head, which is that the big difference between labor trafficking and labor exploitation is the freedom to move or to leave without severe harm. That's the phrase in use. So think about, again, the worst job that you ever had. Have you ever quit a job? Have you ever walked off a job? Have you ever watched a movie where someone said, take this job, and you wish you could do that? You could do it and you would suffer repercussions like a loss of income. You'd have to, you might not be eligible for unemployment. You might lose your health care or access to COBRA eventually, but that's a calculated risk, and it's not coming at the hands of an exploiter. So trafficking is when there's significant harm that would be occurring if the person moved or left their job, like that, any form of violence. Oftentimes we see threats, reputational harm, which is a threat. I'm going to tell everyone you did blah, 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 whatever it is. You embezzled from the university. Anybody can make anything up, right? Or you you shared naked photos online, or I'm going to call your parents and tell them that you had a partner that was from another religion and someone that they would not want you to be with. So those are the kinds of severe harms that can occur. It doesn't need to be bodily harm. Now I'm going to mute myself because I'm a dog, unless it's me next.
Well, I can pick it up. I've done hours and hours of presentations with Nancy, and never has her dog participated before. So something significant is going on in his yard. So again, here are some vulnerabilities. If a student loses their financial footing, you know, it's a scholarship, they lose the athletic scholarship because they have an injury, that they lose a job, you know, inquire about that, find out how that vulnerability is going to play out in their lives. Maybe folks in the Career Center or someplace else hear students talking about applying for some position somewhere that's just too good to be true. And maybe it's kind of blatant, like come start your modeling career and your singing career or your acting career, or maybe it's a little more subtle than that. But one way or another, it sounds too good to be true. Ask about that. Y'all have already brought up this third example. What if there's something wonky about the way people are living together in an apartment and, you know, some kind of shared space? That could turn up in terms for the town, you know, in terms of a nuisance complaint of some sort, and it may not even come through the university, but it's a good idea to ask questions about it. Now, I mentioned this earlier, but I really want to reassure you, if you are working in any way to deal with these challenging issues, you are also working to prevent human trafficking. So one thing you might do, like if you're on a campus or town gown community that committee that addresses something like food insecurity, just take a meeting to think about how this intersects with human trafficking and what the implications might be. Whatever happens, and I realize this can be overwhelming, the first thing to remember is do no harm. So don't put on your superhero cape. Don't swoop in there and assume you're going to rescue somebody and take them to safety and be the person that changes their lives. It doesn't work like that. And frankly, that would be just as much of a violation of power and influence as the abuse can be. So what we want you to do is pay attention to details. If you have the opportunity, you know, ask around, get a few more details. An investigator buddy of ours says, prepare yourself to be a good witness. I mean, not in the testify in court sense necessarily, but just in providing a good report of whatever it is that concerns you sense. So you don't investigate, you don't intervene. If you see violence happening, you call 911 the same way you would with any other kind of violence going on. But first, do no harm. Slow down, do no harm. If you look at the School of Government, or if you Google my name or Nancy's name and human trafficking, you can get to the bulletins we've written for local government primarily, but there's some good background information in there that would be applicable to those of you who work on the campus side as well. It's easy enough to find. And we are ready for your questions. Bear in mind that Nancy and I are willing to help y'all out however we can, whether it's something that happens on your college campus or something that this association does. And I'll leave with putting our contact information up here. So in the time we have remaining, which rabbit hole should we dive down?
I have a question for you. I want to, and I'm glad that we have a 1-800 or 188 number to share, but in terms of engaging the parents in this case, kind of making sure that they know that they are aware as well, is that something that you is this part of the orientation, working with that? And also, how do we involve the future students, you know, maybe the middle schoolers up? what do you feel that if this is something that we need to do that? That's one. And then the other one is how about the immigrant community? How much material is out there translated that can be also being provided to the community?
That was a lot. Nancy and I can tag team with that.
I'm sorry.
No, but those are all
Right.
relevant, and we can't help you with all of them. I will say in some states, like in North Carolina, there's now a requirement that students in public schools receive information about human trafficking. Now, it's not very well funded and it's in the infancy stages, but at least the point that the vulnerabilities and risks should be presented earlier in a person's life is well put, absolutely well put. Nancy, what kind of resources does the commission have that might address some of these other concerns that Gloria brought up?
The commission is an unfunded commission, so yeah. But
As always.
As always, right? Like these are really essential things that we need to address. So go at it. But y'all are in education, you know how that works. But I did want to say that the Office for Victim of Crimes and the Office on Trafficking in Persons, we love acronyms, right? So the AMP model is the action means purpose. They always, that from the outset, have talked about the 3 Ps of addressing human trafficking, which are prevention, prosecution, and protection. So the prevention is upstream, the prosecution of traffickers, and then the protection of victims and survivors. So we use victims when we talk about people who are still in the situation, and survivors, those who have left. We gave, when in the United States, so the royal we, when we first started addressing human trafficking, we were really big on prosecution. We thought we could arrest our way out of this, get the bad guys, you still hear that kind of talk. Let's identify and get them, we'll jail them, and all will be well. We can wash our hands, this crime will be over. Well, we realized that is not happening, and it probably is not feasible in a human world. And so more and more attention is being paid, Gloria, to the kinds of things you talk about, which is the prevention. So finally, there's some funding available, and that includes funding to develop curricula. There are some folks at various, typically schools of social work or schools of public health around the country that are developing curricula for different age groups and families, communities to begin to talk about this. But, you know, I love your idea of including something on human trafficking and orientation. I've never heard of anybody doing that. I don't know if anyone on this call is familiar with that, or if your school includes even a mention of human trafficking, but that's a really, really good point.
I know,
Well,
thank you.
The good news is that there are a whole lot of great resources available online,
Yeah.
including training. So for example, I'm just saying, if you had a group of people who were key stakeholders in terms of being in touch with various vulnerable student populations on campus, you could ask everybody to go through one of these like shorter trainings, 2-3 hours. I mean, it works on up, and then have a conversation. Okay, now that we know all that, what do we need to do differently to help our most vulnerable students and engage in the problem solving? This is the first audience that Nancy and I have had with this many university people in it. So in that regard, we're new kids in this exploration of all the possibilities that might happen.
And really, the article that Margaret cited is the only article, it was published in 2014, that I have ever found in a peer-reviewed journal about human trafficking and college students. So, you know, funding research is another really important area. And then Gloria, you had a second part to your question, but.
Yes, thank you very much. This is a very informative session. I appreciate all what you have shared. As a matter of fact, the University of Maryland, I'm in College Park, we have the UMD Safe Center for Human Trafficking Survivors. So we just did in collaboration with with the professional school, the University of Maryland in Baltimore. But my question, and I'm gonna go back to them and check if they had this in orientation, but it just came to my mind, and I was trying to see if that it was happening in your school. But the other aspect is the immigrant community and how we can kind of provide this information also in different languages. And I'm pretty sure it's already done, but I just want to make sure that that's something that we can also have to consider at some point.
So the organization that I work for, the North Carolina Human Trafficking Commission, does have a website that I think we included on the slides. That's speakupnc.org. And that is in English and in Spanish. Well, sections of it are in Spanish. The Polaris Project hotline answers hotline calls with a human being in English and in Spanish. You can text in English and in Spanish. And they use language lines, which everyone knows are not ideal, but they are available in 200 other languages. The North Carolina Human Trafficking Commission had, and I suspect lots of other states do as well. Sometimes they're called a task force, sometimes they're a commission at the state level. We've produced posters, awareness posters that are required to be displayed. And for instance, all here in North Carolina, we call them ABCs, places where hard liquor are sold, the stores that are run by the state. And they're in currently, I think, 18 languages. And so there is an increasing awareness that our immigrants and folks with limited English proficiency are the most vulnerable, perhaps, of the vulnerable for all sorts of cultural and linguistic socioeconomic reasons. And there is a concerted effort to both produce outreach materials. And so I'm bilingual in English and Spanish. I do a lot of outreach and awareness in farm camps, in community centers, and with advocacy agencies. And I'm one of many, many folks who are doing this. It's kind of easiest for English, Spanish. When we get into other languages and even more underserved groups, it's more difficult, but I urge you to go to the North Carolina Human Trafficking Commission.org and look at our awareness posters. Also, getting people to accurately interpret and translate human trafficking is a challenge because, like in Spanish, okay, so I'm going to say it's la trata, but everyone calls it el tráfico.
El tráfico, yeah.
Not what it is. It's
exactly.
Smuggling. And so even getting accurate interpretations is really, really challenging.
A default setting when you're seeking resources could be to call the hotline, though. You don't have to be reporting an incident to get useful resources from them.
Yeah, they're really nice people and they take questions and inquiries.
Any other questions from the group?
What was that? Somebody put a comment in about watching Law and Order. What was
that?
That
was me. I didn't want to jump in on your conversation, but when you were talking about like how you went heavy-handed on prosecution and trying to get it that way, all I could think about is like, you know, drug cartels where like, of course, the guy on the street corner gets caught, but the guy shipping in the cocaine isn't getting caught. And when that guy off the street corner is pulled, he'll just get somebody else to take his place. And that's kind of what I was thinking about with the trafficking. Like if you're catching the people who may have someone living in a certain situation, but they might be supplying to a larger enterprise that, you know, you're not really getting at the problem by getting that one individual.
That's a really good point, Brittany. And we see that with some of the different business types of trafficking in particular, like the illicit massage industry is really directed by organized crime. And so they tend to be operative in multiple locations and multiple states in a very cohesive manner. And so we call it all the time whack-a-mole. You know, you can close an IMI on Broad Street in your hometown, and then there's going to be another one that either pops up or exists somewhere else. Now, each of the 25 business models can look a little different in that way, and some are sort of mom and pop shops or exploiters who take advantage of someone who's within their proximity, but others are a much higher level of crime.
It's also very scary just because you use the word organized crime, that all kinds of bells go off, you know, and it's like fear for people to also get involved and to help people because fear of repercussion from whoever, and you don't really know who this invisible person, force, or organization could be.
Well, and especially if it's a local gang, you know, that form of organized crime, it could be pretty intimidating to do that. But to get back to the point Nancy made, like 3 or 4 years ago, we were referring to illicit massage businesses, and the level of knowledge about that has grown exponentially in the last few years. And now they realize it's a network, it's an industry. So it's IMIs, illicit massage industries. And it's terrifying. I mean, it truly is the stuff of nightmares to think of organized crime on that scale.
Well, we are running up on time. I appreciate everybody for hanging out with us. This has been great. I really have enjoyed this both times that I've sat through this and versions of these conversations. I want to thank Margaret and Nancy for taking the time to connect with us. We're hopeful that in future we can offer additional webinars, maybe taking out smaller sections of this topic because it is a meaty topic, to find another way to bring that to you guys. So if anybody has ideas or further questions or things they might want to hear more about, we're always taking webinar ideas at ITGA. So please reach out and let us know. Thank you to everybody for joining once again. And we appreciate your time.
Thanks so much for having us.
Thank you.
Absolutely.
Thank you very much. We appreciate the chance to talk with everyone.
Awesome. Thank you guys.
Thank you.
Enjoy the rest of your week.
You too.
Bye-bye.